Alright, another project done. Now what? Let's go see. Nah, it's raining outside. Still no, it's raining outside and it's like 95 degrees. Hey Aries, what do you think I should do today?
I don't know, Brian. Just paint whatever the hell you want.
Greetings, welcome back to Mediocre Minis. In honor of the upcoming Marvel movie Black Widow, I decided to paint up Natasha Romanoff, also called Black Widow, from Marvel Crisis Protocol from Atomic Mass Games. Now you might remember I already did painting Black Widow in the 40k My Way series as I turned a member of the Adeptus Sororitas into Black Widow. And you can find that video right here if you're so inclined. Now, however, the difference with this video as opposed to the other one is in this video I'm actually going to paint up Black Widow the way that she's supposed to be done, since the miniature is basically her. So, let's get started. Turn around to the bench, let's get to painting. As with many of my minis, after assembly I primed Black Widow in, well, black primer, and used some white ink to create this zenithal highlight. For the base coat, I used Abbadon Black from Citadel for the bodysuit and Khrone Red for her hair. While painting the bodysuit, I decided to not paint over the holster, belt, and other straps on Black Widow. I did this mostly to make painting those areas a lot easier later on. Now you might notice that the majority of this mini is, well, painted black. And that's really not too big of a problem, as in reality you can actually highlight black with anything. Now we'll get into this a little bit later on, but do not forget that black, you can highlight it with any color you want. For the skin, I start off with Bugmans Glow from Citadel. This is a darker, redder skin tone that allows for excellent shadows with lots of room to build up in the highlight process, which we'll be doing later on. After the skin is painted on, I move on to the belts using Japanese uniform from Vallejo. Now you'll probably notice that the straps around her holster are actually not supposed to be yellow, but I painted them yellow anyways. This is a mistake, and once I actually looked at some of the box and concept art for Black Widow, I realized I made a mistake and went over it later, but just to point that out now as, well, it's a mistake. For the boots, I actually use Midnight Blue from Reaper and darken it down a little bit with some black. Now while the boots are technically supposed to be black as well, I did actually want some contrast, as the majority of the miniature is also black as well. It's not a bad idea to sometimes change things up just a little bit, use a slightly different shade of paint. This has helped to show off some contrast and to make the mini look a little bit different as opposed to one complete uniform color. And of course, any time is a good time for some touch-up work. And now here I realize my mistake with the straps, and I go ahead and repaint those with Leather Brown from Scale 75. Now, I know I've mentioned this before in some of my other videos, and even here in this one, is do not forget that it's just paint. You can easily repaint over it, you can change what something looks like, you can alter a color. It's not a big deal, it's just paint. So if you make a mistake such as this, and it turns out you don't want to have it that way, just repaint it. Now, if the majority of the base coating complete, I, again, as always, decide to undertake the eyes as of right now and get them out of the way so I don't have to worry about making any mistakes with the highlights. Color-wise, I use my usual ghost white for the actual eyes and also a little bit of black for the pupils.
This looks like shit.
What have I done? Yeah, alright, so the eyes are a complete mess, which is kind of normal. However, with a bit of work using Bugmans glue again, I can quickly cover up all the extra white that spilled over, and after a few moments, it's like it's never even happened. Ah, there we are. Much, much better. Now it's time to get on to my favorite part of the miniature painting process, the highlights. Good evening. We interrupt your programming here today for a very special message from the wife of Mediocre Minis, Vault Fox. Thank you very much for that update. We do appreciate the news. We do hope here at the news station that everything does come out all right. Now, back to your regular program. That was kind of weird. Starting to highlight the hair, I use Mephiston Red from Citadel, and I also be sure to leave all the deep recesses the base coat color of Khrone Red. Now, when doing your highlights, it's perfectly okay to actually repaint a large portion of the miniature, because your darker tone that you're using for the base coat is really just that, a darker base coat for some of your shadows. In many instances, you might find yourself painting up to 80-85% of the miniature all over again with your highlight color, and that's perfectly fine. Just keep in mind that you leave the deepest recesses in areas you want to be in shadow still that darker tone. So you might end up doing a lot of painting, especially with this hair, to really start the highlight process. And again, that's perfectly fine. It might seem very weird at first to recover so much area with a different color of paint. But again, that's almost part of the process, where you simply only leave the darkest areas dark and have your new highlight color taking up the majority of the space. So if you're ever worried about doing that, don't worry, it's part of the process, and you'll get the hang of it relatively soon after doing it a few times and only leaving just small areas in shadow. Once the first pass of all the highlights is dried, I start to add some white to the Mephiston Red for some additional highlights. One thing to keep in mind about using reds, the more white you add, the closer it gets to pink. So be sure to do it very slowly over time, only adding a little bit of white each time to get the exact color that you want. Now in the end, I do end up relatively pinkish, which is actually kind of my goal. With the miniature on the table, you won't be able to see as much pink and see more of the highlights, as most of the time when it's on the table it's several feet away, or when you're looking at it it's probably close to arm's length away. So if you get a little bit further than you want to, in some instances that's okay as long as the highlights aren't too large or covering a massive area. Now moving on to the skin, I use a mix of Cadean Flesh tone and Kislev Flesh for all the highlighting of the skin and hands. When looking to highlight a face, for instance, just keep in mind where areas of light would hit. Areas such as the brow, nose, cheekbones, and chin are some of the areas you want to do focus on. And if you see ears on your miniature, definitely the tops of the ears and not so much the bottoms of the ears could potentially have more sunlight hitting it. So focus on those areas a little bit more than some of the darker areas. Now, as I said before, you can highlight black in pretty much anything. You can use red, green, blue, purple, even shades of gray and white if you actually want to highlight black. And I actually did something again similar to this in my previous Black Widow video, again, linked up here. Now, since this miniature is supposed to be a little bit more realistic, I stuck with highlighting in gray. And don't worry, we're going to be using a lot of different shades of gray here, but we're not going to get 50 shades. That was pretty good. Now, over time, I slowly add more and more ghost white to my black base tone to create the highlights. The first pass only has a very small amount of white mixed in, and I cover a lot of area with this, such as where light would be reflecting. Areas facing towards the sky, such as the top of the arms, legs, chest, shoulders, of course, all get painted with this first pass of highlights. And over time, I actually add more white to get a very dark gray. This is very similar to the hair, as I cover just a smaller amount of area each time, and I don't cover up anything that should be darker. Now, in the end, I make about 3, in some cases 4 passes with a lighter shades of gray to get the effect that I'm going for. Alright, so it turns out I'm actually like 47 shades of gray short. Oh well. Just be sure to keep in mind that with each highlight, you're covering a smaller and smaller area so that some of your previous color can still be seen underneath. With the suit to the point that I was happy with, I start adding some Mephiston Red to the belt and chest emblem, which I will be touching up a little bit later on. Now, when highlighting the yellow and the brown, I use a relatively same method as before, just adding a little bit more white to my base tones to be able to get the highlight colors that I desire. Starting with the same base tone color and adding white to it can actually tie the whole miniature together, as opposed to using several different shades which could look a little bit different to the eye. Again, I'm keeping with the same basic palette and just adding a little bit more white to it to get the shades I want. One nice way to make leather seem a little bit worn and torn is by making a series of X's. This crosshatch pattern can actually simulate some wear and tear and actually gives the area some texture to make it look like it's been used and altered in some way. Then I finish off the highlighting with a little bit of red for Natasha's lips. Now, with all the highlights done, it's time to work on the base and finish the miniature off. For the base, I use London Grey from Vallejo as my base coat, and I also use the same black as before for the base rim. Now, with all the cracks on the base, I use a new product called Tamiya Panel Liner. Now, this is an enamel, so be careful with your application because it can be a little bit more difficult to clean up. And also, this smells a good bit, so if you are sensitive to any types of smells, I would definitely keep that in mind. I would definitely consider having a window open or even a form of a respirator on, because this stuff really does reek. Alright, I'm not going to lie, this panel liner was pretty awesome. Again, while the smell was actually pretty darn strong, it still worked out very nicely. I could just touch an area and the enamel paint would just spread out to where I wanted it to go. Something that I would recommend trying out in the future if you have access to it, but again, do keep in mind that it does smell, it can be a little bit difficult to clean up, and it might not be available everywhere. Now with the base completed and dry, it's time to do our usual and zoom in for those sweet glamour shots. Well, there you have it. Black Widow is now complete. I do hope you enjoyed this video taking a look at the painting of Black Widow, or Natasha Romanoff, right around the same time when her movie finally gets released. Now, if you liked this video, of course, I would really appreciate it if you leave a like and even comment down below things that you like, things that you didn't like. Is there something that you would do differently when painting this miniature? Please let me know. I would love to hear what you have to say. As always, this has been Mediocre Minis, and I shall return.